Hi, and welcome back to my channel, Pathways to God and Significance. My name is Michael Venema. Thanks so much for joining in. And what I do in the Pathways videos is I present a message that I would have given at my church recently on a Sunday morning. And this message is based on Mark chapter 13. And if you're familiar with it, you might know that it gets interpreted in a lot of different ways. And I think I'm going to try to find a way forward with this chapter that I think will be a great help to you if you are trying to follow Jesus. And I think also may clear up a number of questions that people have about how to read the chapter properly. So, here we go. For Christians growing up in North America during the last 50 or 60 years, things have changed a lot. And many of the changes have been uncomfortable, even maybe kind of earth-shaking. A number of decades ago, growing up in Canada where I grew up, it seemed that everyone knew Jesus. You accepted him, and even if you didn't accept him, you at least respected the church and what they said about Jesus. The church, local schools, government leaders, Christian pastors were kind of one big happy family not so many decades ago in Canada. This would have been Canada of the 1950s and 60s and maybe a bit in the 1970s. Now that world is almost completely gone. It was quite a white world, and that of course too has changed, but other developments have been very, very difficult for the church and have left folks in the churches feeling quite disappointed at a number of points. Today, for example, many church buildings in Canada stand empty. Because of anti-colonial ideas, Christians are supposed to throw the hard-working missionaries of the past 1,000 years under the bus. There's not a shred of encouragement from public school teachers for their students, the children of some of you listeners maybe. There's not a shred of encouragement from teachers for those students to take Jesus or the church seriously. At funerals, we increasingly hear a lot about the philanthropy of the deceased or about her ability to generate a bridge tournament, but we hear less about the saving work of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of the dead. The church has been wounded in many of the battles that we fought in the last 50 years on matters of abortion, sexuality, marriage and divorce, the proliferation of drugs, euthanasia, public prayers, gambling, entertainments, Sunday shopping, the pursuit of pleasure and wealth. On all these things, the voices of the church have been almost completely shunted aside. I was once at a municipal meeting north of Toronto. This was in the 1990s. It was during the time when I was a pastor of the first church of which I was a pastor in Newmarket, Ontario. And the topic of the municipal meeting was Sunday work and retail shopping. Representatives of the Presbyterian Church spoke up, and the mayor of North York flatly said, "I don't give a rip what the Presbyterian Church thinks." Well, maybe not all leaders in Canada are that blunt all the time, but my guess is that for the most part, municipal leaders, politicians, don't really worry so much about what the Baptist Church or the Catholic Church or the Presbyterian or the Reformed Church thinks about anything. I'm pretty certain that the political leaders in the country at this time are not eagerly looking forward to the next letter they may receive from the General Secretary of Church so-and-so. The big, happy, church-friendly family that we had 60 years ago is no more. Now, Christians in North America are not the first of God's people to face staggering changes. That level of change, even much more dramatic and painful, faced God's people in Jesus' day. And I think that this is what Mark 13 is about. And I'm going to do as I usually do for these videos. I'll read a section and then I'll comment on it and hopefully make things clear. Now, the first lines in chapter 13. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one of those stones will be thrown down." Now, three things about these opening lines. First, Jesus saw the destruction of the temple coming, and he saw it coming for a couple of reasons. First, I think he saw that a pattern that's found in the Old Testament was being repeated. In the Old Testament, the Jewish authorities played cat and mouse with hostile political powers, and this always ended in disaster, in destruction for God's people. And during Jesus' time, the authorities were playing the same kind of power games with the Roman authorities. So Jesus saw that this pattern was being repeated and it would not end well. The second reason Jesus saw the destruction of the Jerusalem temple was that he fully understood that the days of Jewish religious leadership based in the temple, those days were numbered. Those leaders were corrupt and unable to really help their people. God's patience was with them was at an end. And for those two reasons, Jesus could see that the end of the temple was not going to be long in coming. A second thing about these lines. First, Jesus had reasons for seeing the destruction coming. The second thing about these lines is that for Jesus to say that the temple was going to be destroyed was earth-shaking. Jewish people saw Jerusalem as the center of the creation. We might say the center of the universe. And the temple was the center of the center, the place where God was truly present. If Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, that would be a world-shaking catastrophe, an unbelievable event in which everything would be shaken. And the third thing about these lines, there would be 30 or 40 years between Jesus' death and the destruction of the temple. And I believe that everything Jesus says in Mark 13 was fulfilled during those 3 or 4 decades. And if you can hold on to that basic idea that all of what Jesus is saying is going to be fulfilled in the 30 or 40 years between his death and the destruction of the temple, if you can hold on to that basic idea, then I think all of Mark 13 comes into focus very nicely, becomes quite clear. So, the next few chapters, or next few lines in the chapter. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled?" In other words, these 4 disciples have, I think, been talking amongst themselves. Their discussion is kind of inconclusive. Their discussion was triggered by what Jesus said about the temple. And so they come to Jesus, "Well, when? And will there be indications that the temple is about to be destroyed the next day or the next week?" Well, Jesus doesn't answer them directly. Instead, he says to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you." In verse 5, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many." So, there will be trouble and conflict in the land, partly as a result of the controversy that Jesus has caused, controversy because of his opposition to the temple, which was an intense opposition. And related to that, the whole country was sitting on a stash of dynamite because of the great tension between the Jewish religious leaders, the teachers of the nation, and the Roman occupiers. The crisis would deepen. Some leaders of the Jewish people, realizing that there was a crisis and things could go very badly, wanting to lead the people through it all, might claim that they speak on Jesus' behalf after he's gone. Jesus tells his disciples, "Don't pay attention to such leaders. They're fake. You stay with me." Let's continue reading. Verse 7, "When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains." So before the temple is destroyed, there'll be lots of warring. The disciples might feel that this battle or that battle means that the temple is about to be destroyed, but be aware, Jesus teaches them, such battles and wars are going to go on for a while. In addition, earthquakes And probably because of the fighting, destruction, and earthquakes, there will be hunger, famine in some regions. But none of that is a sure sign that the temple is just about to be destroyed. It may seem like the whole nation of Israel is falling apart, but the buildup of war and terror will go on for some time. Remember, we are talking about a 30 or 40-year stretch leading up to the destruction of the temple. And while this buildup of terror and anxiety is building, how will you disciples, James, John, Peter, and Andrew, and the rest, how will you be treated? Not very well, it turns out. Jesus says in verse 9, you must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. You know, the synagogue is a Jewish place of worship. Imagine somebody being taken into a synagogue today, or being taken into a church building and flogged. But Jesus says, this is what will happen. On account of me, Jesus says, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. Let's unpack those lines for a couple seconds. Difficult times ahead for the disciples. And yet, Jesus is saying to this group of former fishermen and ordinary family business owners that they will stand where they never expected to stand before, in the courts of rulers and kings as they go to their trials. The disciples themselves would be tried and punished. Now, that raises a question. Would that mean that the project to tell the good news of Jesus Christ will be cut short? Because after all, the disciples will be heading up this project. No way, Jesus says. The good news will be spread to all the nations before the temple is destroyed. Verse 10, the gospel must first be preached to all nations. In other words, even though the disciples would be arrested and would face torture and death, the mission that Jesus gave them would absolutely go on. The disciples might be killed, but the mission of God to spread the news of his kingdom would be completed. During the 40 years leading up to the end of the temple, the nations in the Middle East and other nations around the Mediterranean Sea will hear the message of the kingdom of God. Now, the disciples hearing this might be wondering, what in the world are we going to say in such circumstances, say at our trials? And Jesus promised them they would not be alone. The Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, would be with them. The Spirit will give them words to say. Verse 11, when you are arrested and brought to trial, don't worry beforehand what you are to say. Just say whatever is given to you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Now at this point, there's some comfort in those words, clearly, but at this point, you can also imagine the disciples wondering, just how bad will things get? Will anyone support them? And Jesus ends up saying, don't count on anyone's support. Verse 12, brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Well, as the early church began, there were many people who accepted the disciples, the apostles, and their message before the temple came to an end. We learned that from reading the book of Acts. But at the same time, there would be intense opposition. And Jesus is making it clear to his disciples from the get-go that the opposition they face will be deadly. Again, from the book of Acts, you discover that the early Christians fled Jerusalem because of the opposition they faced. People do not willingly become refugees, but this is what so many of the early Christians became. Persecution against the disciples and the other followers of Jesus would drive people away from their homes and families. The religion and politics of the day would tear families apart. And nevertheless, Jesus says next, don't lose your way. You stand firm. Stay faithful to the end, and God will save you. And so now we come to some very difficult lines in our reading. Verse 14. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to enter the house and take anything out. Let no one in the field go back home to get their cloak. And how dreadful it be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. And pray that this will not take place in winter, because these will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning, when God created the world until now, and never will be equaled again. Well, just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, it gets worse. Jesus talks about something abominable and desolating standing where it does not belong. Such a thing had happened before. The Roman king Antiochus, ruling Palestine from the year 175 to 164 before Christ, BC. The Roman Antiochus treated Israel so badly, with so much cruelty, that the Israelites rebelled against him. And when he came to put down the rebellion, his forces entered the temple, stopped the sacrifices, and set up an altar for the pagan god Zeus. And what do you think they offered as a sacrifice to Zeus? If you guessed pigs, you'd be correct. They sacrificed swine to insult the Jewish people and their faith. This triggered a time of extended violence and war in Israel, again, around 170 BC. And I am pretty sure that when Jesus talks about an abomination that causes desolation to once again stand where it does not belong, he sees this pattern happening again, just as it happened in the past. Tensions between Rome and the Jewish leadership would become so great that once more the Roman occupiers would take over the temple and desecrate it. And indeed, that is what the Romans did. This happened in the 60s, not the 1960s, but the 60s. There was a terrible war between the Jewish people and the Romans. It got so bad that priests were murdered in the temple itself. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived during this time, wrote about all of this in his 7 books called The War of the Jews. Romans once more took over the temple and destroyed it completely this time, just as Jesus had said, not one stone remaining on another. And then violence consumed the land, desolation. The people living in Jerusalem fled to the hills and surrounding regions. How difficult it would have been for pregnant women or for anyone who had to flee in the cold of winter. I think that this is what Jesus saw coming, and all the things that Jesus talked about were things that the people he was talking to would see. In verse 30, truly, Jesus says, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So naturally, the Jewish people going through such a crisis would look for a leader here or there. But Jesus again cautioned, don't follow any such would-be leaders. At that time, verse 21, at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or look, there he is, he's come back, don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So, Jesus says, be on your guard. I've told you everything ahead of time. Be on your guard. Be on your guard for what? Well, be on your guard, Jesus tells his disciples, for people who want to be the kind of leader I am, or who say that they are me coming back, or who say that Jesus has come back, and look, he's right over there. I alone am the Son of Man, the Messiah. No one else is. You stay with me. When I come back, you'll know it. And now we come to the end of what Jesus is teaching in this passage. In those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from the sky, and heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Again, words which need a little bit of reflection because, well, what exactly is Jesus getting at? About the sun darkening and the moon no longer shining and the stars following and the powers of heaven shaken, we find the same kind of word pictures in Joel chapter 2 in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 13, in Isaiah 34. And you may remember also that as Jesus died, the sun went dark. And lines like this also show up in Acts chapter 2, where Joel 2 is quoted. The temple will be desecrated. It will be torn down, not one stone on another. The people of God will go through terrifying times. The sun, the moon, and the stars growing dark. The heavens and the earth will tremble. The world falling apart. But will it fall apart? No, because the Son of Man, Jesus, will appear in glory and will send his angels to gather together the people of God from the ends of the earth. Now, did Jesus mean that he would come back in glory after his death on the cross, that he would come back in glory at his resurrection, the third day after his death? Or did he mean that he would come back at some time in the future? I think the answer is yes and yes. And did Jesus mean that angels would be gathering together the people of God, one, in the early days of the church after the temple was destroyed? Or two, did he mean that the angels would gather together the people of God through a much longer stretch of time, including in our own time? Or three, did he mean that the angels would gather together the people of God in the future when he returns? And I would say that the best answer to that question is yes, and yes, and yes. Well, a summary of what we've considered so far. Jesus taught his disciples that they would see unbelievable upheaval and destruction in their own time. Jewish worship, the city of Jerusalem, the Jewish temple, the Jewish way of life, all of it swept away. Jesus would help trigger this. He attacked the temple itself, as we will see next Sunday. His death, Matthew records, resulted in the earth quaking, resurrections of Jewish saints, and the ripping apart of the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple. Jesus' resurrection from the dead turned upside down the supremacy of death over us, one upheaval after another. And out of it, God's purposes will prevail. The glory of God would be revealed. The angels would gather together from all over the world, the community of the people of God. Well, I started by noticing that for many Christians in North America, things have changed painfully and greatly. It seems that so much of what once was taken for granted has fallen apart. Where we once felt pretty sure that the future for God's people would be a positive one, today we're not so sure about that. But here's the thing. When the Jewish world fell apart at the time of Jesus and the disciples, the followers of Jesus discovered that God gave them new things to do. When the Jewish world fell apart, a falling apart that Jesus, as I say, helped trigger, his followers discovered that nevertheless, God had a new day for them, and that God's purposes were going to continue on. The gathering of God's people would absolutely not cease but continue. The early church went through very difficult days. All the old structures tumbled. The temple, not one stone left in place, burned to the pavement. The priesthood murdered. The synagogue, the Jewish pilgrimages, all gone. But the people of God did not disappear, and they did not stop being gathered. And that is because the Son of Man, Jesus, the crucified and risen, sent his angels out into the world to bring together the people of God. Friends, at my church, Bethany Church, or whatever church you may be a part of, we may wonder about the future if you're living in North America. Well, anywhere really. And, so we may wonder about the future. But most importantly, we need to continue to look to the crucified and risen Jesus Christ for strength, for insight into what to do in our own time, and for faith, a faith that through all times of blessing and all times of disruption, God's purposes continue to be fulfilled. The angels continue to do the bidding of Jesus in gathering his people. That does not mean that you or I know the future, but it means that we have a future. Jesus is leading the way. There's nothing that can stop him. His purposes will never fail. He will gather his people. And in all of this, Jesus has something for you and for your church to do.